And yes, the mics are on. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this session. Thank you for the organizers for making this happen and hosting. My name is Natalia Anslava. I'm a journalist, and I care a great deal about the subject we're going to discuss today, and I think we all should, because it very much it's pretty fundamental to the future of the world that we're going to live in. In my own reporting career as a journalist, a few times when I've been in hairy situations, a colleague would make me pause and say, remember one thing, no story is worth being killed for. And it's an old journalistic cliche, it's a bit of a truism. It was useful to be reminded of it because it makes you think about the safety precautions you can take, about being more cautious, more careful. But what do we do when being cautious and more careful just simply does not work anymore? It's hard for me to bring myself to say that we are celebrating the World Press Freedom Day at a time that just this week, 10 of our colleagues were killed in Afghanistan in a secondary bomb blast. The reporters were on the spot. I'm sure you've all seen the news reporting on the initial blast, and the attacker actually was in their midst with a camera. He was trying to blend in. They were the target. Journalism is under assault on all sorts of different fronts in all sorts of countries, from the Philippines to South America to Russia and beyond. And increasingly we're finding that the Western world, the United States and Europe, are no longer quite the safe havens that they used to be. So what do we do? Well, I think some of the people on this panel today live their lives facing this question pretty much every day, and it's a great pleasure to introduce, not in the order that they're sitting in. Well, to the left of me is Roman Dobrokhotov. He's a Russian journalist and founder of the Insider magazine. Yasmin Merey, in the red shirt, is a Syrian journalist and activist, originally from Homs, who has lived and worked through the horrors of the Syrian conflict. At the end of the panel is Andrew Caruana Galizia, who is a Maltese diplomat and a son of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the journalist whose assassination a year ago sent shockwaves through the global journalist community. And last but not least, joining us, the representative of UNESCO, Marius Lukušunas, who we're going to start with today, because UNESCO worked on a pretty massive report looking at the state of the press freedom from 2012 to 2017 for the 5-year period. So before we dive into the details of what it's like to be a journalist in the field today, let's hear from Marius about the findings and the discoveries that you made while putting it together.
Thank you very much. Indeed, UNESCO tried to publish a report, World Trends report on freedom of expression and media development. And the report is important because UNESCO has 191 member states, and we wanted to provide the member states, which are in so many instances, for example, when we're talking about safety of journalists, it's the primary responsibility of the government to ensure this safety. So we wanted to give a methodological as well as a conclusive basis for what is the state of media freedom in the world today. And basically we've analyzed it through the 4 angles, and all of them are important. All of them are based on international principles. So anything you do within the UN or any other intergovernmental organization has to be based on international principles which had been adopted by the body. So the four main angles we analyzed media situation today is freedom, independence, safety, and pluralism. And I think all 4 are important because in all kind of different ways they capture what makes freedom of expression possible, what makes media freedom possible. If it's not free, of course, it's useless to talk about it. If there's no media independence, if there is no editorial independence, it's useless to talk about journalism, journalism as a profession, about the integrity of the process of gathering, processing, and disseminating news. If journalists are not safe, if they are being killed, then I mean, it's very clear that in that kind of situation there is no freedom of expression, and media freedom of media cannot be exercised. And the same with plurality, of course. So a very quick capture. You see some of the conclusions on the screen, but very quick capture on all four categories. First, freedom. It's mainly negative. It's a global trend. We're also analyzing in the report, we have 6 regional reports coming out in a week or two, which will go into the 6 different regions like Asia, Africa, Europe, and so on and so forth. So freedom is mainly negative. And why mainly negative? Of course, we are looking here into a legal situation. Legal restrictions are growing, especially that's connected to regulation on terrorism and extremism. Then, of course, the second very important thing, which is relatively new, is internet shutdowns. We are thinking about internet, about something technological. We used to think like maybe 5-10 years ago. Not anymore. It is a crucial part of media freedom, where freedom is being exercised. It is a crucial platform. And 2015 we had 15 shutdowns. 2016 we had 56. And so you see that it's more than triple. And then, of course, the digital age brings its own things. So protection of sources, journalism cannot function without protection of sources. Now, within the digital platforms, how do you protect the sources? And is there legal protection? So that is, these are the 3 main things which mainly enables us to say that freedom is in a negative situation. Then, of course, you have independence of journalism, where you have it's half-half. You could say that the licensing, the other issues, attacks on media, especially, but attacks, the verbal attacks, the attacks coming from the political side of the spectrum, with the fake news and all this discussion. This is, of course, not giving a good credence to the independence. From the other hand, we could see that self-regulatory systems are pretty popular, and they are developing across the world. Not everywhere, but across the world. And in addition, I think there is a big discussion how to regulate internet. Should it be self-regulatory approach, or should it be a regulatory approach? Especially when we are talking about fake news and disinformation in the context of elections and political dialogue. And then we have safety of journalists, where situation could be only worse. That's a very quick characteristic. And the last one is pluralism within the field. And here we have, with the advancements of internet, digital platforms, of course there is much more content, but the quality of content, that's what we are questioning. And of course also what we are seeing is the decline of traditional providers of quality information, like newspaper circulation is going down, audiences of the serious TV stations is going down, and so on and so forth. So this is situation in general. The report also is focusing very much on the new things, like fake news, for example, which is, in our view, is the misused term. It's part of the old-fashioned disinformation, just weaponized through internet platforms, and many other things. So this is basically the context where we are in with freedom of media all over the world.
Pretty bad news.
Could be better.
Could be better. Great general overview, and it would be good to kind of dive into the specifics. And I want to start with the journalists at the panel, both Yasmin and Roman. You obviously work in very different environments. You're now based in Berlin, but you are still working with journalists in Syria. I know it's probably will be very hard to generalize like that, but if you were to pick sort of two main challenges, 2 or 3 main challenges that people face beyond physical security, I mean, this is where it's hard to talk about this in the context of Syria, what would they be?
Well, the first one is the colleagues who are, of course, struggling to work inside Syria are not professional journalists. You have to work all the time with them on how to frame the issue that they want to report about, and also how they are controlled by different armed groups. Now in Syria, the colleagues that I am working with in Al-Bawaba website are based in 5 cities: Aleppo, Hama, Idlib, Hasaka, and Quneitra. And here you talk about a very different and complicated map when it comes to authorities. So you have to think all the time about, do we talk about this, do we talk about that, shall we hide this? It's very dangerous, and the point that with these armed groups, it's not a joke. If you report about something, you are risking your life. The second thing, feeling that you are very far away. I mean, I am based in Berlin, and these colleagues are inside Syria, and they are the ones who are looking at the issues. And then you have all the time to compromise between what is attractive and what is important from your perspective as a professional journalist to report about, and what these people think that it's moral and it's a kind of, let's say, obligation towards murderers, towards victims to be reporting about. So yeah, it's very, very complicated and very tough.
Roman, and what about Russia? If you were to pick sort of the main challenges of your day-to-day journalistic life, what would they be?
Well, so there are 2 different questions. It's censorship and propaganda, which are interrelated, but still different stories. So, like 10 years ago, only Russian TV was under Kremlin control, and internet was almost free. Now, even all the major internet media outlets are under Kremlin control. So, I would say that there are around 5, 6 really big, well, not big, but like well-known independent media sources. And all the rest are like bloggers or just independent journalists, freelancers who publish some investigations or something else important. So that is about censorship. But also what is quickly changing is the situation with propaganda, because I think before 2014 it was something like I would say something vegetarian, so it was very slight, and it was like just distortion of information, just putting some focuses that put Putin in good light and something like this. But from 2014, after Russian invasion in Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, Russian propaganda became very, very aggressive. It's trying to picture human rights watchers and independent journalists as enemy of the states, so they try to make everybody in the country like confront these people, and sometimes even they are attacked because of this propaganda. And it's actually looks very similar to propaganda of Stalin's era or of fascism in Italy and Germany in 1930s. So there are the same cliches about enemies abroad and inside the country, about our like cultural traditions that are not like Western democratic traditions, and so on and so on. So this is dangerous for journalists, not only because now the government can imprison journalists, but also because you sometimes cannot feel safe, because really these people believe propaganda. And many of the people who invaded Ukraine were not officially soldiers, but those people who believed that there was a boy crucified in the center of Ukrainian city by Ukrainian fascists and so on and so on. So this is a challenge, and what we are now trying to do, also the Insider project, is trying to show how this propaganda is organized. So we made investigations of who are these propagandist journalists, how they're paid for their job, who is controlling from the administration of the president. We are debunking this fake news on everyday basis, so we really monitor all the major Russian official TV channels and news agencies, and like every day we have an interesting fake story debunked. And that, I think, it really works.
Is it working?
I think it really works because as we just see the traffic and we see that these articles are really, really popular. So people want to know if they are deceived and how they are deceived. They want to know what is the real story. And we see that like these articles with fact-checking or debunking of fake news can get like several hundred thousands of unique users, and for us it's pretty big number. And it's even comparable with TV, though TV of course have like millions of people who see them, but if you see concrete program, concrete like news article, it has also like several hundred thousand. So it is we already can say that now when 75% of Russians use internet almost every day, internet is a really competitor to TV, and we see it on the streets because the biggest protests in Russia, there are protests of young people, sometimes even teenagers. So these are the people who don't watch TV anymore, because this new generation just doesn't watch TV. Not because of propaganda, but this is just...
So you'd really say that one of the biggest challenges of being a journalist in Vladimir Putin's Russia is just competing with the information kind of over the propaganda that is being produced?
Yeah, and it's like David and Goliath. It's not real competition.
More so than your personal safety, or...
It's like a partisan war when you are like living in a forest and make these small attacks on this regime objects. So it doesn't really like a competition. But still we have our audience. So we have, I would say, like 20% of Russians who just don't believe propaganda from the very beginning because they know how to navigate in this informational space. And I think this is enough to make changes. As we see now in Armenia, for example, where also the majority of population at first supported the regime, but when changes started, we saw that it was pretty quick and effective. So the same.
Yasmin, do you relate to that? Do you feel that sort of that putting that alternative message out is preparing a ground for something that can work in the future?
Yeah, of course. But I think that it's not only a propaganda in Russia. It's turning into a kind of an international propaganda nowadays, and I mean. It's a struggle we are leading against the Russian, Iranian, and maybe the Syrian also, the regime part, propaganda, and how to be struggling against it.
Or learning from each other, of course.
The last fake we were debunking, it was about white helmets.
Right.
So
yeah, the Russians love those white helmets. Yeah. Yeah. Andrew, I want to bring you into the discussion. The extraordinary thing of having you on this panel is that your story is in Europe, and it's probably the one of the most shocking things that happened to journalists, to journalism in the last couple of years, partially because it happened in Europe. What I want to ask you is, how do you think the assassination of your mother has changed journalism in Malta? Like, what effect? I mean, in a country as small as Malta, I imagine it has had a profound effect on changing the climate for the media, for everyone involved in the media. Like, how did it change that climate?
Well, that's a very good question. Maybe the first thing I should say is that I'm no longer a Maltese diplomat. It wouldn't be.
Sorry, I thought I said former.
No, that's
Apologies.
fine.
Yeah.
It clearly wouldn't be possible for me to be here today if I was still a Maltese diplomat.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are many of my former colleagues who write to me saying that they're reprimanded for writing on social media about my mother's case. So that brings me to your question, where when a journalist like my mother is killed in a targeted car bomb attack, two things can happen. Either society will start to look inwards in fear, or it will try to open up and push for change. What's clear is that it will be an inflection point. One expects something to change. The situation will either get worse or it will get better. And what we're seeing now is a hardening of positions. So the majority of the Maltese population is afraid. They are afraid of their own government, I would say. Even people who support this government with their vote know that this government can be vindictive and will come down hard and fast on people who express dissent. And that extends beyond journalists. It extends to civil servants. It extends to the police. It extends to the judiciary. It extends to every single institution in the country. But the effect on journalists is obviously more visible. And the impact hasn't been entirely negative. What we saw is a real coming together of independent newspapers, which were traditionally in competition with each other. And in many ways, my mother, because her readership often exceeded the combined circulation of all of the country's independent newspapers, she was their biggest competition. Her own personal website drove the news cycle in Malta. She exposed all the biggest corruption scandals in the last 5 years in Malta. And before that, for about 25 years, she was also leading public opinion on a number of major issues like Malta's EU accession, on whether Malta should be tolerant towards asylum seekers, for example. And with her gone, that leaves an enormous space. It leaves a huge vacuum. And it's reassuring to see that some voices have tried to fill that vacuum. So we've seen independent bloggers, for example, who show enormous courage. We've seen a new investigative news outlet called the Shift News, which was supposed to launch about a year after my mother was killed, but they accelerated the process because they saw there was this gaping hole, and it would be unacceptable for that space not to be filled by independent journalists. Because one thing we have to be sure about is that we leave a silence that's louder than my mother's voice. That's the only really way of ensuring that killing a journalist isn't a successful strategy for organized crime and corrupt politicians. But this requires often heroes, and being a hero isn't a sustainable strategy. It can get you killed, it puts you in danger. So my fear is that the people who have filled the space left behind after my mother's assassination are not receiving all the support that they need. And that's not just financial support, which is obviously necessary, but it's also moral support from outside of Malta, from European institutions, from press outside of Malta. We've seen a dramatic change in that with the Daphne project. So there was this consortium of investigative journalists, which included some huge newspapers like The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde, and they came together to continue my mother's work. And that has given incredible courage to Maltese journalists. And that is the best possible response from journalists when one of their colleagues is killed. But please stop me if I'm going on
No,
too
no,
long.
no. Okay.
But that brings me to an important point, that we cannot leave journalists alone to fight this battle, because more of them are going to get killed. And it's also unfair. As citizens, we need to show solidarity. And one way of showing solidarity is to compel our governments to take law enforcement seriously. Because journalists only get killed when there's nothing standing between them and the story. In a country like Belgium, for example, if a journalist reveals that a bank is laundering money for the Azeri ruling family, there would be an immediate police investigation. If that weren't the case, that would leave the field open for retaliation. And in Malta, journalists have often found themselves the targets of the people that they investigate, because there's simply no institutional intermediary. And that is something that really needs to change, and it's a problem that is reflected in other European countries as well. And
Can you talk about that? Because I'm wondering what kind of precedent does it say, and are we at some sort of a crossing point where it can go one way or the other depending on the lessons? Like what are the lessons that Europe should be learning, and what are the risks if those lessons aren't learned?
So speaking very broadly from a European level, what I realized is that organized crime and corruption is transnational, and it's very tightly networked in Europe. Corrupt politicians in Malta have very strong relationships with corrupt politicians in other European countries. Journalists are responding to that extremely effectively. The Daphne project is a really good example. They created a network of people in all the relevant countries, and they're investigating very effectively. The response that we haven't seen is from law enforcement. Law enforcement is not transnational in Europe. It's still fragmented at a national level. And so what we've effectively created in Europe is a playground for organized crime and corruption. We have an internal market, we have a borderless area, but we don't have transnational law enforcement authorities. So we've created in many ways a monster, this safe space, a lucrative market for organized crime and corruption without the tools that we need to tackle it. Many people in Europe think that Europol is some kind of European FBI, but it isn't. All it is a clearinghouse for information. The only thing it can do is take information from, say, the Bundeskriminalamt in Germany and pass it on to the Maltese authorities. But it can't lead an investigation. It can't compel a national police force to investigate. But most serious crime in Europe today is completely transnational. And what we see is that organized criminals and corrupt politicians are often the first to exploit the European market. They're the first to exploit new openings when it comes to cross-border trade, public procurement, for example. And this is obviously a long-term issue, but it's become a pressing need, and I believe the time is now to push for more effective law enforcement at a European level. If we don't do it now, then we're going to miss an extremely important opportunity. There's political will in the European Parliament. I think there's growing realization among the European public that this is necessary. And I think this should be a priority also for journalists, because the best way to protect journalists is to ensure that the stories they investigate are followed up by authorities.
I don't think I can quite overstate the sense of vulnerability that I personally, frankly, feel when I hear you speak about this. Because, if we have car bombs blowing up in the European Union, then imagine how vulnerable others feel in other places. And I think the precedent that your mother's case sets for a wider journalistic community is really frightening, and hence a greater responsibility for the authorities here to learned the lessons. But I want to hear from Yasmin and from you, Roman, as well, about whether you share that sentiment that kind of the Western world, from a perspective of a sort of of a person who is practicing journalism, a non-Western, not in a democratic country, there was always that sort of shining light of like someone's got it sorted out, someone knows what they're doing, and someone's safe. And do you feel like that has been taken away to an extent? That sense that.
Well, I think it's not like a white and black situation, because Europe is changing every year and every decade, and all the Western countries too. So I would say 1970s, for example, Europe was much more dangerous place for journalists than it is now, especially in such countries like Italy, for example, when mafia was much stronger, and Germany, where there were like these terrorist groups, lots of other regions where there were investigative journalists had a lot of problems. So we now put emphasis on the cases that we see, like in Malta and other situations, because they are recent. But in long term, of course, I think Western countries becoming more and more safe here. And in Russia, actually, if we speak about personal safety, I think it's even not the greatest problem, at least for journalists in Moscow. Of course, if you work in Chechnya, you are not able to be a journalist at all. But in Moscow, the personal safety is not the main issue. The main issue is that if you create a good story, for example, we investigated MH17 when they shot down Boeing there in Ukraine, and we found a Russian general involved in it, and we proved it. We have his voice recorded, we have everything. So this was 100% investigative story, but they created 200 other stories with 200 theories of who also did this. So they created an informational noise, and they created on very different languages and spread it to very different countries, to their newspapers, and if you like Google it in internet, you have all of that. So you have to have some experience to understand how to differentiate between responsible journalists and these fake propagandist media outlets. So this is a challenge both for Western countries and Russia. So that means that we have to invent some solutions of how promote media literacy and how to make mainstream media more interesting and understandable for common people, to spread this investigation better than they spread fake news.
Go.
If I may step in a little bit with the statistics. Actually, if you take the 6 regions, the leader, of course, is Middle East and North Africa. 191 journalists killed since 2012, and Eastern Europe and Russia is only 17. And then, of course, the second most terrible place for journalists is Latin America and Caribbean, with like Mexico leading, absolutely. But there is one thing which unites all these killings. Only 1 out of 10 cases are brought to justice, and the justice is being done on the perpetrator. So the impunity issue here is, I think, is one of the very, very important aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is where Daphne's case is so striking, because this is actually something where on one hand, astonishing that this happened in the Western world. On the other hand, this is something where that could have some sort of positive outcome and really lead to some changes if it's possible to achieve them. That's probably a luxury that most people working in the developing world don't have, where cases disappear and are never brought to justice, where there's no sense of any wider justice at all. I'm kind of picking up on what you were. I'm interested that you kind of keep going back to challenge of sort of being drowned out by the noise and by all the information noise. I'm interested whether how your work is affected by that. I mean, I don't think there's any question that Russia has been a pioneer and like a real innovative force of like making propaganda, you know, sort of slick and sexy and powerful and, you know, quite chaotic but effective. And I think a lot of countries have been learning from that. So could you, Yasmin, could you talk about whether that affects your work, kind of battling with that, the other side, the other message? And Marius, I was wondering also, maybe then you can draw on some of the things that you've, how big of a part of the paper that you put together was, you know, the issue that Roman is bringing up. Kind of.
Well, I always talk in a very narrow context, which is the Syrian one. To be honest, as Syrian journalists who are trying to work after the revolution, we don't have the resources that something like the Russian media has. So we all the time try to pick up some points which is attractive for the before moving also to Europe. It was not an idea for us to think about what is attractive for Europeans. Now you feel that you are lost in a very wide and big and how to describe it. I mean, a lot of topics are raised here in the European media, but one thing I always think about is really feeling safe. I mean, when I compare my situation since I was in Syria, then moving to Turkey, and for a short while in Lebanon, and now in Berlin, it's completely different. But you still also think all the time how to bring solidarity based on what you are trying to do, how much access you have to international levels to deliver what you are trying to work on. And then for me, as a Syrian journalist, I always have the question, how much stories we still have to tell to change something about what's going on in Syria. I mean, today there is this speech in the international media about building peace again in Syria, rebuilding the country, the reconstruction, and we all the time ask about, okay, what about the fundamental question about the political transition and the political change? So are we affected? Of course we are affected, because as I said, we don't have the same resources. We are not as strong as that media.
Yeah, so in most places, basically, the narrative, it's not the independent media that has control of the narrative. And I think from your report, it seems that the independent media is trying very hard to get hold of at least a piece of it. So would that be correct? Is that what you found?
Yes, that's correct. I think, and also we have to look into the causes. Of course, the crumbling traditional business model is one of the causes, because the media, which was providing quality information in many countries where you don't have a restrictive regimes, where you have enabling legal regimes, they are facing this sort of media crisis because of the loss of revenue and all these kind of things, and of course because of the advancement of new technologies, where everybody could be a journalist in a way, and social intermediaries like Facebook and Twitter, they are taking over a lot of the public discourse. Now, from the other hand, of course, you have to look into and that's what we discuss in our report. What is fake news? It seems that it's something very new, very coming out of nowhere, but in fact it is not. We've had a very interesting meeting with one of the vice presidents of Facebook, Richard Allen, who was in Paris in UNESCO, and he was saying, like, if you please define me what is fake news, and we'll take it off our
I'm not
platform.
surprised that Facebook was saying that
of
too,
course.
frankly.
I mean, we all know that but from the other hand, there is also truth in that, and I mean, we look.
They had the definition with Cambridge Cambridge Analytica and did exactly nothing about
Yeah,
it.
there are many definitions of what is fake news, but I think in the core, it is the disinformation which is just happening in the environment where the new ICT technologies are enabling it to spread much wider and so on and so forth. So we have to be really, and for a moment what we are seeing is there is a little bit of a race. From one hand, the governments really tend to, or preparing to regulate. We have a few laws already which are there. You know, and some of them are, I'm not talking about European, but about other laws, some of them are really bad. So it's a big question, would they bring more good than otherwise? And from the other hand, we see the industry and the stakeholders who are trying to self-regulate or to impose certain self-regulatory measures. We all know about certain measures Facebook does and others and so on and so forth. So in UNESCO, of course, we are trying to moderate that process in a way in order to see, but I think we're in the very beginning of the process. And I think we also, from one hand, of course, it's irritating, but from the other hand, we have to remember that let's say if we go back into 1947, the biggest proponent of regulating propaganda, you wouldn't believe who was in the UN when the debate was launched immediately after the Second World War. It was the ambassador of Soviet Union. Because you know, regulating always you can have some advantages. So you have to be very careful with freedom of expression talking about regulating. Debunking is another thing, you know, of course, but regulating by law you have to be, I think.
Yeah, please.
So I think we have actually two worlds. We have a world
Yeah.
of free countries where there are mainstream media who are challenged by the fake news going through social media. And we have authoritarian or totalitarian countries where the mainstream media are the fake media spreading viruses, conspiracy theories and so on. And we have internet and social networks that are challenging this regime and their propaganda. So it's like vice versa, right? And so the answers also are different. So if you can see some regulation as an answer in free countries, in authoritarian countries like Russia or Turkey or China, regulation means censorship, always, because that is how they live. And I also want to agree that actually fake news provided by the government is not something very new, because even I, as a patriot, I think Russia invented it. In 19th century, security services of Tsar Nikolai I created very famous conspiracy theory on protocol of Zion thinkers, yes, and spread them in France, if I'm not mistaken, which is even now one of the most popular conspiracy theories. Then in Soviet times, there was also a special operation by KGB of spreading conspiracy theory that CIA assassinated Kennedy, and it also still now one of the most famous conspiracy theories. So that is a very big tradition and very important one for modern Russian government. They now create these fakes on everyday basis. That is actually maybe the only one Russian technology that is still works better than in any other country in the world. So I'm a little bit even proud of it.
True innovation.
Yes, true, real, like Russia is like Elon Musk of fake news.
That's right.
So every day there are new technologies, new ideas, and it's working in different countries. I'm not sure that it really influences American elections, but it maybe played some small role, and if you have like 50% on 50% during elections, that can help. It didn't help in France, it didn't help especially in Germany, but it helped in America when the situation was...
Well, what it certainly does seem to do, we're not going to figure out now, especially whether it did influence the US elections or not, but what it did is definitely polarize, it has a very polarizing effect on the society, and it's basically, you know, has given the governments all sorts of tools to spread the message, and the Russians happen to have used them very effectively and gave many lessons to their allies and various other authoritarian regimes. But when it comes to, I mean, going back to, and again, it's a little bit hard to kind of have a unifying theme here because each of your cases are so fundamentally different, even though if the struggles are somewhat the same. But I wonder, again, going back to Andrew and sort of Malta, I wonder whether polarization, whether your mother's case caused any sort of polarization, and whether, what kind of debate are we seeing now?
Well,
if at all.
I mean, I should start maybe by saying that I don't believe the cases are actually that different. And if we go back to fake news, or let's call it disinformation, it's often driven by states. So the idea of regulating disinformation is absurd because the origin of most disinformation is states, and in particular Russia, a pioneer in this area. If we look at what's happening in the Skripal case in the United Kingdom, it's all sort of Russia-driven. And so we need to ask, when and where is disinformation dangerous? And it's mainly dangerous when there are no independent arbiters of the truth. So in Russia, for example, if Raman exposed that Vladimir Putin has an offshore structure and is profiting from, state revenue, which he is, would there be an institutional reaction? Would Vladimir Putin be arrested? No. So that means the battle is fought out in the media, which is dangerous because then it becomes a war of words and there's no one to independently verify Raman's story. Whereas if you take France, some investigative journalists published a story about how Sarkozy received 50 million euros from Gaddafi for his election campaign. He was taken in for questioning by a magistrate. So then there's no media debate about it. I mean, there's an independent investigation happening, and they are going to establish whether or not this actually happened. And in Malta, and also in several other European countries, there's the same problem, where a journalist like my mother says, look, the Prime Minister's chief of staff is laundering money. He has a secret company in Panama with probably a bank account in Dubai, and he is creaming off a commission from the sale of passports. If the police don't react to a report like that, what happens? You get a disinformation campaign to drown out that story. The journalist is discredited, demonized, and it leads to a deeper, to a sort of hardening of the populist response. And so one important thing to recognize in Europe as well is that now the threat to journalists is the state more than anything. Before it was ideology, it was, say, Islamic fundamentalism, neo-Nazis, but my mother's assassination, Jan Kuciak's assassination, the attempted assassination of an Italian journalist, Paolo Borrometti, in Sicily, these are all, if not state-driven threats, then they're driven by people who enjoy the protection from state actors. So deeply entrenched organized crime networks, corrupt politicians working with organized crime networks, people who feel audacious enough to kill a journalist in 2017 or 2018. These are people who feel untouchable. That's clear. And so if we go back to the misinformation debate or disinformation debate, this is simply part of a systematic strategy to undermine press freedom in Europe. And it's only effective when institutions have already been undermined. Disinformation is not effective when you have an independent police force, a very powerful parliament, and a very powerful and proactive judiciary. It's only effective when there's nothing else between the journalist and the corrupt politician or organized criminals. And in Paolo Borrometti's case in Italy a few days ago, this mafia boss was actually picked up on the phone telling his son, we need to silence this journalist because sometimes a message needs to be sent to the others. In other words, targeting an individual will have a ripple effect and would be able to leverage the assassination of this journalist to basically create a blanket of silence. And when is that strategy effective? It's effective when the mafia don't fear the police. Why are they targeting journalists? Why aren't they killing policemen or magistrates, as they used to do in the 70s, for example? And for me, that makes me think the situation is worse now, because we're seeing journalists being killed, we're not seeing officials being killed, which means that our institutions have already been, in many ways, captured in several member states, silently. And how has this happened? In my view, there's been a sort of unholy marriage of corrosive capital from countries like Russia, from Azerbaijan, China, which has somehow married populist politics. And we've created these post-ideological monsters, these political forces which are simply a vehicle for power. And when they do take office, it's a lot like organized crime taking office, because the backers of these political forces are either autocracies or organized criminal networks. And once they are in office, then they have all the levers of government at their disposal. And I see these conditions in several European Union member states, including Slovakia, Malta, obviously, but also Cyprus, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. And then if we go to the Western Balkans, the situation is even worse. Montenegro, Serbia, these are all potential EU member states. And so before, we should do it now, but especially before, say, Western Balkan countries join the European Union, we need to make sure we have the tools to defend ourselves from this unholy alliance of Russian money and populism. And a final point, if we want to combat fake news or disinformation in Europe, what's a good way of doing it? I would say by going after the funding. Look at the Brexit referendum, for example. There are suspicions that some of the funding was channeled through, say, Arron banks via Russian intermediaries. So I think if we clamp down on money laundering, on illicit financial flows into Europe, then in many ways we're going to cut off, we're going to close the taps on a lot of the sources of disinformation in Europe, and we're going to close the taps on a lot of the money that's funding populism in Europe.
I would also add to this that this is just, I think, the part of the problem, because what we saw in Great Britain, we saw that all the major political parties, all the major, most respectable newspapers, all the really important opinion leaders were against Brexit, and that didn't work. That is a very, very unusual situation. The same we saw in America, because all the Republican establishment was against Trump, and of course all the Democrats were demonizing him, and that didn't work. So that means that mainstream journalism in Western countries a little bit lost contact with its audience. And this is not the problem of governmental institutions, the problem of this mainstream media, that they are working not enough good, that, New York Times can have their rich, educated audience that are aware of everything what's happening, but they also need to explain stories to common Americans who live in the suburbs or in some southern states and just don't attracted by stories of New York Times. So there's maybe a challenge for sources like BuzzFeed or for other media. And they actually already started to do this. For example, BuzzFeed is already doing investigations and explaining them in a very understandable way, trying to make them viral too. Also, again, debunking fake news also may become very interesting and entertaining we trying to make it in a simple, interesting language, and we get enormous traffic on our website when we publish these stories, so they're popular, and that's how they can make an effect. And for example, European Union, like 2 years or 3 years ago, started. They have their own unit of fighting disinformation. They had staff around 3 people, I think, and comparable budget, fighting all the Russian propagandist machine. And how they fight the propaganda? They publish some kind of announcement on their website on the European Union, like saying that this story was false and this is what really happened. And they had, of course, like 0 readers.
Penetration, yeah.
So and that's strange when you think that, well, if it is a real informational warfare, okay, if NATO would spend 1% of their military budget on helping independent journalism, investigative journalism, creating special fund for debunking fake news, to supporting investigative journalists, fact-checking, that would be like several $billion, which is much bigger than budget of all the independent media in developing country together. So that will be a game changer. But they would spend it on new military, I don't know, aircraft or military ship or something like this, and they will lose the battle, because this is also a question of security. Like in Ukraine, this fake news created this war because people took their guns and went to Ukraine to kill these fascists who crucify babies, right? So that is what I think European governments should think about, also and in question of security.
But then it turns out the European government needs also to be preoccupied with the situation with journalists within the European Union. So, like, where does it leave organizations like yours or yours? You know, if the West, if you're completely, incapable of getting anything out of the country that you come from, where do you expect your support to be coming from? Who do you turn to as an
look at the
independent
Syrian
news outlet?
situation now. In 2011, we thought that there is a real opportunity to have censor media in Syria, and it's the same case in Egypt also, and other countries which witnessed this uprising. Now look at what's happening in Syria. The journalists who tried to do some work, they are even still arrested or killed, or we are now in Europe. We are not doing any direct work in Syria. The only media associations which is still going on in Syria is the regime's one. When also some European associations and donors try to support building media bodies called alternative Syrian media, now the majority of us are struggling only to continue working because the fund is going to other fields, even reconstruction or anything else. So the point is how much we are risking the censorship of media in the Middle East, and how much we are still keeping professional people who can do this work. It's a question to all the, not only the governments in Europe, but also the institutions which help it in establishing these media associations, and now there is a big question mark.
Yeah.
What to do.
So Marius, I'd like to turn to you with that, and we'll open up to questions in a minute. But we have this very comprehensive report which paints an incredibly depressing picture. But we also, maybe you can shed some light on where the solutions may be coming from, and what you're doing, or the people that you probably have a lot more access to that any of us are saying in terms of support for the independent media, and what are we going to do about all of this, basically?
I think that we all more or less know what do we have to do. The problem is that knowing is not enough. It's a question of resources. It's also a question of political will in a specific member states. As an intergovernmental organization, what we can do, we can of course moderate the issues. We can try to promote. We work on the basis that that we come to assist the member state when we receive the request, because still the world is not one big intergovernmental organization. The world consists of member states and sovereign countries which do take decisions whatever they are. But I think also what we have to do. I mean, there are a lot of assistance programs which are looking into legislative reform, into introducing. If you look, the UN has a perfect tool, Universal Periodic Review, which is being organized by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and there are very clear four aspects actually of media development which should be addressed, and if they are properly addressed, then the world will become much a better place. The first one, of course, is the legal guarantees of the regulatory guarantees of freedom of expression and media freedom. Then, of course, we have a question which we've discussed. The previous panel discussed it in a very interesting way. It's the getting rid of defamation, because defamation is a very well used tool, to shut down media and to introduce especially self-censorship. The third one is, of course, if we are looking into the area of implementation of legislation, it's very important to have independent institutions which are licensing broadcasting companies, licensing and also ensuring the implementation of the principles, and then of course safety of journalists. So it's just a very small menu. I mean, we can continue and continue.
Sure.
It's
But
an
do you
endless
feel?
story.
Do you think that there is a shift in kind of prioritizing all of this? Do you feel that there is a sense that people are realizing that this is important? And obviously, again, you speaking as a representative of
I think it's very hard to give one conclusion for 190 something member states. It's the regions are different, the countries are different, but I think in general there are few things which everybody agrees. Now, if they follow up, that's another thing. But everybody at least agrees. And safety of journalists, for example, whatever politician you'll be talking, everybody would agree that it's a very bad thing to kill journalists.
Right.
So there are a few things which are very obvious, and then of course there is a debate on other things. And I think here, within the debatable things, it's very important to keep an eye on international standards, because these are the standards which explain what is the right movement and what is the wrong movement. So these two things, I think we have to keep them in mind and to promote them and keep them in the center of the dialogue, of the global dialogue.
Andrew, you've spent a lot of time lobbying, and I'm sure meeting various people, and you sort of paint a very clear picture of what could be done, what needs to be done, and how the organized crime and corruption is at the core of it. And basically, what you say means that a pretty fundamental changes have to happen to the very way that our societies are constructed in the moment in order for this trend to be stopped and reversed. And I think also it would be fair to say that the conclusion of this conversation is that the help for independent journalists elsewhere outside the Western world right now can really only come from the Western world, because the Syrian government or the Russian government are not going to be interested in supporting independent journalism. That's just not part of their agenda. In conversations that you are having while you're trying to follow up on what the horrific thing that happened to your family, do you see all of this sinking in? Do you see this big picture emerging in the minds of people? Is there anything that makes you hopeful that maybe in the next decade or so we will get to a place where we'll change the kind of the basic rules of the game to
Say one reason that I'm here on this panel rather than spending time remembering my mother privately, for example, is because me and my family soon realized after my mother was killed that a narrative was developing that her assassination was a fluke, an aberration, that it was an attack on freedom of expression, for example. And we found that extremely frustrating because, yes, it was an attack on freedom of expression, certainly, but it betrayed deep institutional failure. And that was something that hadn't sunk in at a European level, that European decision makers were still looking at it as a non-state issue, as a sort of private attack on an individual journalist, whereas we needed to get the message through that no, my mother was facing threats for her entire life, her entire career as a journalist, and that those threats escalated in the last 5 years of her life until, the last couple of years. She wasn't even, going outside. I mean, she avoided it. People would harass her in the street, people would stare at her, people would photograph her, film her. And so I don't accept that it was an aberration in an otherwise normal democracy. It was something that was not only tolerated by state authorities, but actively encouraged. And I think we finally got this message through, at least in the European Parliament, that the state in Malta, also in Slovakia, is at one level or another responsible for what happened, because the source of the harassment, the source of the threats were state agents. But there's a massive difference in terms of how the European Parliament responded and how the European Commission responded. And I see there are some officials from the European Commission here. And this is similar to UNESCO's position, where an intergovernmental organization can decide it's just going to be a platform organization where it's going to sort of convene member states and let them discuss, their issues and decide for themselves what the priorities are. Or they can be normative organizations and actually use their influence to push for normative change. And the European Commission is a very jealous guardian of its impartiality. It's very hesitant to condemn individual member states because it has a sort of judicial role as well. But because the European Commission doesn't have any power to prosecute crime, for example, or to supervise national police forces, that makes it all the more important for the Commission to use soft power, because it doesn't have hard power. So it needs to vocalize concerns. It needs to start saying, there's a problem. We don't have the power to deal with it. We want to have the power to deal with it. And we are appalled by what's happening. We're afraid. We see this as a systemic challenge to European values. That needs to happen. The European Commission can't leave the European Parliament doing this by itself. And on a broader point, the decline of press freedom globally, and the decline in particular in Europe and the United States, isn't a coincidence. Europe and the United States were the sort of traditional emitters of European values of press freedom, and the decline globally of these values reflects a deep weakness within the core Western states that used to uphold these values. And so we need to recognize that it's our weakness in Europe and the United States that is fueling a global slide in press freedom. And it's time for us to counterattack. It's time for us to feel at least emboldened by the example set by Jan Kuciak, by my mother, and finally stand up for what they were fighting for and do our part to at the very least, create a safe space within our borders in Europe. And beyond that, hopefully to fuel positive change in our broader neighborhood, like in Russia, in the Balkans, in North Africa, in the Middle East. But we're currently not capable of doing that within our own frontiers, and that needs to change. And it's only when that changes that we'll be able to make a difference outside of Europe.
Well, I think on that not very positive, but certainly inspirational note, we should open up and see whether any of you have questions. Yes, please. Is there a microphone to go around, or do you want to? Is there anyone with a microphone? No, it doesn't look like it. Just go ahead and I'll repeat it for the...
I would like to congratulate 5 persons seated in front of me because the debate was of an exceptional quality. I'm most grateful and I'm extremely moved. I just wanted to make one comment. You have stressed the very disappointing and frightening way that freedom of the press is evolving worldwide and in particular in Europe. But I wanted to add one small optimistic note to this very negative story, but realistic story. And that is the fact that in France there is an independent weekly that is called Le Canard Enchaîné, which brought about the fact that the expected result of the French presidential elections did not come through, that a person who was corrupt had no chance of becoming the French president. And this is thanks to a journal which sells 400,000 numbers weekly, which is totally independent financially, does not belong to a press group, and does not accept advertisement from industry or other financial sources. I have no conflict of interest because I'm from Brussels, I'm not French.
There are certainly many encouraging examples as well, and especially in the United States and the reaction of the American media and sort of all the non-profit outlets, places like ProPublica, they have sprung up. Yes, please, if you have a question.
Thank you. I'm a journalist, Italian journalist in Brussels. I first of all want to thank you for the really extremely interesting debate, all of you, and in particular Andrew Caruana in Galizia, because he highlighted the links that there are between organized crime and the safety of journalists. And the case of Italy is probably a very interesting one, because in Italy, I don't know if many people know, there are 19 journalists who are living under escort, complete escort all day. So because they've been threatened, like the one that Andrew mentioned, Paolo Borrometti, a Sicilian journalist. And I want to also thank him for highlighting what has been done, what the European institutions are trying to do, Commission and European Parliament. I support an ONG in Italy, which is called Ossigeno per l'Informazione. And in fact, Ossigeno organized a meeting in Malta University a month after the killing of Daphne, because we wanted to be there as a support for the journalists who are in Malta and of the people who have to deal with this terrible case of Daphne. The problem was that not many people came, not many journalists came, because we were told by the dean of the university who organized with us this meeting, because people are still afraid in Malta, and the people think that probably if Daphne had not been saying writing all that she had written, probably she would still be alive, which is a terrible thing to say to a journalist who was killed exactly because she wanted the truth to be told. So I want to underline the fact that linking to the mention that Andrew made of the role of the European institutions, that the Parliament and the Commission, they created a Center for Press and Media Freedom in Leipzig, and there are several groups, several associations that support this center, and we want to enlarge also the importance of the role of this kind of activities that support the freedom of the press and journalists who are threatened.
Thank you so much. I saw a few other hands around, and I want to make sure that you get the chance to ask the questions. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Do you have a question? Great, thank you. Yeah, please.
A short question. Thanks for a good debate. I am not a journalist. I am a medical doctor here in Brussels, but I came here especially for some other things. Especially the Andrew and the European member story is very touching. They mentioned in medical doctor, we call it the good diagnosis leads to the best therapy. That means we have here a diagnosis. Andrew touched it. There is corruption, and there is a good organized, institutionally organized corruption. And also the second European man touched the impunity. Here is the diagnosis. Why we, as a journalist, you are not looking the best from the people to crash the operational channel between the people and the journalist? Why you are not looking for another empowerment of the journalist? Because
is that,
why I
is that the question?
Yes, that's
or
the
a
question.
comment?
No, that's the question. Why I did that? Because I come from Ethiopia, and in Ethiopia the government is hiding the money and colonized the people, 100 million people, and hiding money here in Europe and everywhere.
Thank you. Well, I don't know which one of you would like to answer that, but I believe there are plenty of journalists who are doing exactly that. There should be even more journalists who should be doing that, but please, if one of you wants to take that on.
I believe that question merits a response from Europeans. So as a European, I'm ashamed to say that we profit from corruption in Africa. We profit from corruption in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, and we have a deep reluctance to tackle this problem. In the UK recently there was a law passed on something very basic, an extremely basic change, where the overseas British territories like the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, now need to have open public registries of company ownership. What's so controversial about that? It's extremely basic, and yet they're fighting it. And London, for example, there are really interesting money laundering tours of London where you can go around on a bus and the guide will show you skyscrapers which are completely empty, and they'll tell you which offshore companies own them. And so there are entire towers which are owned by secret companies registered in the British Virgin Islands, for example. And probably most of them are owned by people within African governments or close to African governments, or also the Panama Papers showed us many of them are owned by Russian oligarchs. So we're playing an enabling role in Europe. We're enablers of corruption. we are providing the getaway vehicle for corrupt people outside of Europe. And that's an enormous responsibility. It means we have blood on our hands. And we should, I think journalists in Europe should definitely scrutinize this, very shameful role that we play. I agree.
Marius, want to
A
address
few
that?
quick comments about impunity, of course. First, of course, within the UN and UNESCO, we have, a few years ago, we have announced that we'll be celebrating all over the world, commemorating the International Day to Fight Impunity, and that's what we are doing. The last one was in Africa, in Arusha, where we've massively tried to involve law enforcement and especially judges, because we think that fighting impunity without judiciary is only, of course, it's good always to raise awareness, but also to involving this professional group is of extreme importance, and actually it was quite successful. And the second quick comment I wanted to make, UNESCO it's not only impunity also, but next to it we have to keep in mind arbitrary detention and imprisonment. And UNESCO has a prize, Guillermo Cano prize. It's a Colombian journalist who was killed because he was investigated corruption and related to drugs and to mafia, and of course to. So each year we're giving a prize to a person who has been worth receiving it. And in 2014, I think, we gave this prize to a famous Ethiopian journalist, most probably you know, Madam Alemu. She received the prize, and after a few years she was released, and we were very happy. And it's actually not only her, it's also Hatija Ismailova, the similar story, and many other similar stories. So everybody does what they can within the framework of their activities.
Do we have any? We have one question, but it would be great if we could do questions and not comments, because we have very little time left. So let's get two more questions at the same time, and then we'll answer them together.
Thank you very much for the debate. My question was about the ownership of the press in relation to the independence. It's fairly easy to spot an authoritarian state having propaganda. But what about Western states? I mean, the Murdoch, the Maxwell in the UK. I'm French. In France now, you have big groups, industrial group behind. How can you make sure that this does not, compromise the independence? Thank you.
And who is the question for? Is there anyone?
UNESCO,
I guess for
Yeah.
let's get the other question as well, and then
I'm Idris de Bruyne. I'm working for Journalism Fund. We give grants to journalists who collaborate. We give money before they do the job and not afterwards. A prize is always funny. That first of all you have to take a risk, and then you get an award if you are killed or if you have done your job quite properly. The question is, if you put more money into journalism, not in the media, but into the journalists, maybe we will have more accidents. I don't think we have a big tradition in investigative journalism in Europe, and I think now it's growing, the interest in investigative journalism. I think it's growing, the collaboration between journalists, and I think there is more money for investigative journalism, for independent journalism, and I think there will be more journalists killed in the future in Europe because now we're getting stronger and more interesting journalism, and maybe also there it's a moment for organizations and countries to put more money in foundations like ours and other organizations to stimulate the independent investigative journalism, because this is also a point I think that's not discussed here. Why is it that journalists are vulnerable? Because they are not well paid. They don't get any money to do their dangerous job.
yes, we didn't get to the not well paid issue. I agree.
Sorry. I actually think that the second question was answer on the first question, because from my point of view, this is the best model of independent journalism, because the former model of making money through advertising, there is not very good model for investigations, because it's sometimes very difficult to be profitable being an investigative magazine. Maybe it is sometimes in some countries it works, but sometimes it's not. So that would be great if we would have more foundations that are financed by the European Union or by some big international organizations. And for European Union, actually, like I don't know, dozen million of euros per year, for example, that's not really great money for their budget. But for independent journalism, that means that you can have like 6 big major media outlets totally financed by this money, for example, right? Or even more. And actually, models like BBC, for example, when they also funded by taxpayers, but not by the government, it's but by the taxpayers. So they are independent from the government, but still have taxpayers' money. That still works pretty good. BBC is like one of the best, actually. And but that doesn't work for like Russia, right? So that means that must be international organizations, or like again, like European Union, like some union of states, funding especially independent projects, like investigative projects, debunking of fake news, like focusing on that. And that's a very easy thing to do. I just can't understand why European Union like spends so little money on that. That's so strange in this situation when they are in real danger.
Yes, please. And the next one, Yasmin, nodding as well.
Sorry. Just on a positive note, the European Commission has launched a fund for cross-border investigative journalism, and it's run with the International Press Institute. And Raman raised a really important point, that in Europe we have a situation where investigative journalism in, say, Hungary is funded by the US State Department, and the European Union funds sort of support projects for journalists or human rights defenders outside of Europe. And I feel we've reached a stage where we can no longer take a strong press for granted in Europe, and we need to start funding it directly. If not as governments, then via foundations which are co-funded by independent public institutions. I think that's...
Yasmin, I saw you shaking your head.
Actually, because I agree with everything Roman said, but I also wanted to also add that investing in journalism is not only for paying journalists for things that they are doing and sometimes they're not paid for, but also in the Middle Eastern case, it's also to provide us with the sources to protect ourselves sometimes, because when you talk about digital security, you need to train people. When you talk about safety on the ground, you also need to train people. So it's not only about paying, it's only about providing people with safety tools.
And also such organizations like OCCRP and other associations of investigative journalism are extremely helpful here, not only because they share experience, but also that helps solidarity, because if one member of OCCRP network is threatened or something bad happens, other members are showing solidarity and starting investigating the topic because of which he was threatened. So this is also an effective model, because that doesn't depend on like European bureaucracy. Because it's like alive and flexible and quick, so I think it's one of the models.
And I'll take that positive thread, bone that you've thrown to us about how...
We're launching a grant program within a month for a cross-continental collaboration between journalists with training in it, with training in safety and training also how to find financing. So unfortunately, it's money that comes from the lottery, for God's sake, the Dutch lottery.
But it's great. I think we have time to take one more question, if there is one, and that will be the last. Yes, please, lady in the black.
Hello, my name is Monika Łagodzińska. I come from Poland. I run in Poland an NGO which is called the Lifelong Learning Fund, the Foundation for Lifelong Learning. Peritia, but we also have like two legs. One is education, the second one is helping NGOs, also incubate NGOs. And I just wanted to tell you that we have the propaganda, not yet the censorship, but might have censorship very soon. I would like to somehow just kind of open the space for maybe just like future thinking. We have the artificial intelligence soon going much and more in all different activities. We have NGOs who really suffer, not only in Poland, but also in Hungary and, of course, other countries. We have journalists suffering because they cannot do the job, because they are not paid. So we have very similar problems. But on the other hand, when I'm organizing an event, I cannot ask, nobody comes, no journalists come to write about what we are doing, because this is not blood and body. So my question is, how would you see your role in the future, generally thinking? If you have trouble really with issues you would like to say, if you're thinking about investigative journalism, but on the other hand, NGOs who would like to write will not have your support anyway. And we have altogether artificial intelligence, which means a lot of big data, a lot of information that can be in internet, and still only very little people that read us, that come to the events. Like we have NGOs, 100,000 NGOs, 1.5 million people, but Poland has 36 million people, and maybe 18 million people are adults. So we still have the majority that is not really taking or reading different materials to have its own opinion, but like in 30-40% maybe watch propaganda media. In Russia, maybe it's more. So how to maybe somehow combine it and have journalists and NGOs also dealing practically with education, with civil society education, how to do that together and really not separately? So kind of an open question. Thank you.
Well, who would like to take that one on? I think we can maybe summarize it as, what's the future?
I don't mind kicking off with an attempt to answer that question. One thing I was thinking is that it sounds really sinister, but journalism also needs to be weaponized. And often, frustratingly, I read news reports of incidents that directly threaten the press, and the journalists will be reporting on it as if it were a car accident. And that's deeply frustrating, because this is something that is threatening the very ability of this journalist to write the report. And you think, come on, you need to, a lot like a sort of medieval farmer who had to kind of turn his plow into a sword, it's maybe time to start using journalism against people who threaten the freedom to write and to publish and to inform. And that sounds sinister, because journalism is meant to be impartial. It's not meant to be advocacy, and that's why it's also important to separate civil society from journalism. But at the same time, when the threat is existential, then you cannot pretend you're going to fix the problem just by doing your job reporting the news. You're not. It requires a different kind of reaction. And that's why investigative journalism is effective, because it's not news reporting, it's digging deeper. And it's publishing findings, conclusions of why something is bad. And that's why it's specifically that kind of journalism that needs to be supported. And that's why it's sometimes sad to see taxpayers' money going into public broadcasters, which simply report the weather, or car accidents, because anyone can do that. And the BBC played, in many ways, that role in the Brexit referendum. It was reporting both sides impartially, even though one side was lying and the other wasn't. And a journalist should actually look into whether someone is lying before publishing, ideally. So yeah, that's...
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more in terms of the dangers of he said, she said journalism that we all that we've become very prone to. But I think it's a genuine dilemma of journalists today, of sort of where do you stop being a journalist and start becoming an activist. And I think people like Yasmin probably don't have much of a luxury of that. If you're working in a country which is openly hostile to journalism in itself, then you pretty much get labeled as an activist, and you have no other choice. I think there is more choice elsewhere in the Western world, for sure. But Yasmin, I would really love to hear your thoughts on kind of that, that balancing of activism and journalism, and where does it leave journalism, and where are we headed with that in the future?
Well, you try to balance them, but then inside yourself you don't feel balanced at all, because it's mixing all the time. The point that in a country like Syria, we all the time, think that it's very important also to build a healthy relationship between people and journalism, because during decades people didn't trust media in a country like Syria, because it's a totally controlled media, and then you use it only to know about like some resolutions by the country or like public information. But then to think about how to make people, and especially now when we move to Europe, now when I think about Syrian refugees who live in accommodation centers, who live all over Berlin or Europe, how to make them also think about being in a place like Europe, to think about the role of journalism, to think about how much we can change through the journalism, because it's something that we are not used to do in Syria. Of course, you have all the time to think about what to report about and what to be active at. But again, in the Syrian context, it's all the time close to each other. For me, I am working on women issues, so all the time I report about women. But at the same time, I'm also politically active, so I also report about political issues. It's inside each other. And I don't know, sometimes I ask myself, okay, once it comes to a solution in Syria, what kind of work many of us will be doing, as many of journalists who are working at the moment on the Syrian issue, I'm talking about Syrian journalists, were not journalists before. I was a linguist before 2011, and I never expected that I will be working as a journalist. So it's all the time interacting.
Aman, anything to add?
Well, I am activist and journalist at the same time. I started both in 2005. So I was at that time a student, and I was a leader of a youth movement. So I organized a political activity. So it's like grassroots activism, old school activism. And at the same time, I worked in a newspaper. And the difference is when I go to a street action, I decide in the morning whether I would be an activist at this day, so I will shout slogans and so on. So I will put my press card at home, and if I'm arrested, I would never say that I'm a journalist, so I would be like sit in police department silently. And if I decide that I would be a journalist, that I will be silently just noticing what is going on and then reporting what was going on. So I don't see it is any problem at all. If you're a fair journalist and you're a fair activist, you just sincerely say that you have this kind of views, and that is even much more sincere than you pretend to be impartial, but somehow in your report everybody sees that you support this or that values. So this is different school of journalism. For example, American school of journalism means that this is okay, that if you're have Republican views, you work on Fox News. If you have Democratic, you work for MSNBC, and if you have a good sense of humor on Comedy Central, this is okay. For example, and actually in France it's okay, but I would say in Germany, for example, this would be considered something not very good. But Germany is not that polarized, so that's easier for them. But for most of other countries, I think journalists should be sincere, speaking about their values. Of course, what we mentioned, as he said, she said, journalism is just bad journalism. Because if you if you give a floor to a person who is lying and you don't mention that this statement about fact is a false statement, that means that you're just a bad journalist. Of course, you just show that this is like this is our editorial note that like this number is not correct or this statement is not correct. If it is a factual statement and if you didn't fact check and if you fact checked it and if you put it in a newspaper, you are responsible for this fake news, not the person who told you. That's it.
And I think we're out of time, although no one's waving at me and telling me to stop, so. But I think we are out of time. Oh.
Yeah.
Yes, we are out of time. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Thank you to our panelists for their amazing contributions. And let's hope that the report for the next 5 years will paint a slightly brighter picture and do everything we all can in the meantime to make sure that that happens. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.